pfSense and UniFi routers are popular choices for home users or home labbers. Many people switch from UniFi routers to pfSense because of pfSense functionalities, and many people switch from pfSense to UniFi routers for the user-friendly features. And I also know some folks who are switching back and forth very frequently. I plan to have some videos to talk about how to do the same configurations in different systems and what are the main differences in different system setup. Because they all have many features, it's impossible to cover everything in one video. I plan to have a series of videos. In this particular one, I'm only going to talk about the initial setup, which is okay, you get the hardware, how you can do some basic simple configurations to make it up and running. Currently in my home network, I use a 1U Supermicro server as the main pfSense. It is my internet gateway, router, and firewall. In this video, I'm not going to use this particular one for the demo. I'm going to have a separate hardware, which is in my home lab, to do the pfSense related configurations. I do have several UniFi routers. For example, on the screen you can see a UniFi USG-Pro. Although I don't use them as my main router, I configure them in my home lab frequently. This is another UniFi router I'm going to use in this video. It is a UDM-Pro. This is a mini PC. It has 6 Ethernet ports, which is perfect for a custom pfSense build. This video is mainly about software configurations, but because they have hardware differences which have to be addressed. For example, pfSense, you can custom build the hardware, which means you can have maybe just 2 network ports, or you can have many of them. And you can flexibly designate which one is for one, which one is for LAN. But when it comes to UniFi, you have to use whatever hardware provided by UniFi. For example, this USG Pro, it has 2 ones, 2 LANs. And for example, this UDM-Pro, it has 2 ones and multiple Ethernet ports. So they have different hardwares. In this video, I'm going to use similar configurations for all of them. This is the diagram I'm going to use for this video and for the whole series of videos. I'm going to use the same configuration, same network topology for the demos, for the migration configurations. First, look at the top part. I have my home's main pfSense here. It's connected to internet. Then I have 3 separate but connected hardware configurations running at the same time in parallel. The first one is a mini PC. I set up pfSense here. In the middle, I have a USG Pro, and in the right, I have a UDM-Pro. They are all connected to my home network using 2 Ethernet cables. Because you are viewing this video, I assume you already have some UniFi switches. In this video, I'm going to use a very simple 8-port UniFi small switch. Because it's a UniFi switch, I need a UniFi controller to do the configurations. That's why in all the 3 configurations, you see UniFi controller. To demo the different firewall rules in future videos, I need to set up different VLANs, one for the normal default LAN, one for IoT devices, and a separate one for surveillance cameras. Admin VLANs for your administration or sensitive work. As home user, we care about the guest network. So I'm also going to have a future video just to show how to set up guest network in different routers. For all the different VLANs, I'm going to use Linux virtual machines to connect to different parts to demonstrate the connections. As you can see, for all 3 of them, the topology, they are very similar. We will cover the details in this video and in future series of videos. Because each router will be configured with multiple VLANs, and each VLAN I'm planning to connect to a dedicated Linux virtual machine. So I need many Linux virtual machines to run at the same time. So I use 3 separate 1U Dell rack mount servers to run all the virtual machines. And I make sure each Linux virtual machine has a dedicated Ethernet cable connected to the UniFi switch for each router. As I mentioned in the diagram, for each router, I'm going to use a dedicated UniFi small switch, and the first one is connected with the pfSense. This one is for USG Pro, and this one is for UDM-Pro. As you can see, I already connected the Ethernet cable to Linux virtual machines. As the goal of this video, we are going to configure the 3 separate routers. This one is for pfSense. This window is for USG Pro. As you can see, the UniFi controller correctly shows the USG Pro as the uplink device, and here it shows all the VLANs correctly. You can also see for pfSense and for UniFi controller, I have a separate virtual machine setup just to run the UniFi network controller. The last window is for UDM-Pro. You can see something different here. First, I do have a separate Linux machine, but just to run the client for UniFi controller. For the server, you don't need to do any setup. It's already built into the UDM-Pro. And another different thing is you see a UniFi AP here. We are not going to talk about the guest network and the Wi-Fi in this video. I'm going to cover it in future video. Let's start the configuration. Let's start with the initial setup of pfSense. If you just prepare to migrate from UniFi routers to pfSense, you may think, okay, you need to experience a lengthy initial setup and even some troubleshooting processes. It's a surprise. The initial setup for pfSense is super easy, super clean. By the way, I won't cover the software installation for pfSense. That's super easy. I'll assume you just installed the pfSense software on the hardware, then we start from there. This is the initial screen you will see after you installed the pfSense. It's already showing you the WAN address and the LAN address. In fact, after the initial boot, pfSense is already ready to be connected, to be configured. The initial IP address is hard-coded. LAN Dhcp server is already been set up and running. The WAN is getting IP address from Dhcp automatically, so it's super easy for you to use a client to connect to it for the initial setup. To begin the pfSense initial setup, we need to first connect to the pfSense box. Fortunately, the initial installation of pfSense already enabled the Dhcp server for LAN interface. Let's validate it. Okay, let me go to the setting. Make sure for IPv4, I have Dhcp automatic, yes. Then go back to details. Now it's having IP address already, but let me make sure it's getting the correct IP. Let me disable, then enable the interface. Let's check the IP address. Yes, it's showing the correct subnet. It's 1. Everything looks good. Now let's connect to pfSense. I'll connect it to the hard-coded initial IP address 192.168.1.1, and the initial username is admin. Initial password is pfSense. This is the wizard. Just go through several initial steps. The router should be up and running. Okay, give it a name. I don't want to change it. For DNS server, I want to keep whatever the WAN Dhcp gives it, so I don't want to change it. Next, I accept whatever initial time setting. Then WAN interface, yes, the default Dhcp looks good to me. I do not want to give it a static IP because I'm using the home lab interface, so the WAN interface is not really directly connected to internet. It's connected to my home network. So for testing purpose, I do need to connect to private networks. So the default setting for block RFC 1918 private networks doesn't work for my particular home lab testing purpose. But if you are setting your own real pfSense router for your home network, you may want to leave this default setting enabled. For my case, for this video's purpose, I want to uncheck it. I do not want to change the LAN interface. This default 1.1 works for me, but in your case, you can choose whatever local subnet you want. Give it a better password. Very simple setting. Theoretically, you even do not need to change anything. Just go through it. It's up and running. Let's finish it. Just to make sure, if you have doubt, you may go to, let's say, firewall. You can check the rules. Now we have two interfaces, WAN and LAN. And for WAN, you do not want to change anything. For LAN, anti-lockout rule enabled, so that whatever wrong settings you make, it will guarantee you still be able to log on to your pfSense and to configure the chain from the LAN interface, which is very valuable for people who want to try different settings. The other two rules, it basically enable any-to-any. That's the initial setting for LAN. It's good for this video's purpose. In the future video, we are going to talk about how to add different rules. Now we already have two interfaces. Let me go to a Linux virtual machine, which is connected to LAN. Now on the screen, you see three windows. The first one is our diagram. We already partially configured the first part, which is for pfSense. We have the pfSense server set up and running, and we have the default LAN interface configured already. And now this lower part window is for this particular virtual machine, which is connected to the LAN interface. Let me make sure we have the correct IP address. Yes. It's .1.108. It's automatically allocated through the DHCP server of pfSense. According to the default LAN setting, I should be able to connect to internet. But let me validate it. Let me ping, let's say, Google. Okay. It looks good. This LAN interface is ready. Next, let's configure these three VLANs, 20, 30, and 40 for IoT surveillance and admin network. And then we need to add the corresponding interfaces. Then we need to configure the UniFi switch with this newly created VLANs, and then we will do some network testing. To add VLANs, we go to Interface, Assignments, then I click VLANs. By default, there's no VLAN created. The LAN interface is using the default VLAN, which has ID 1. When you create VLAN, pay attention to this parent interface. In this video, we are only using two physical parts from the pfSense hardware, for one for LAN. All the VLANs will share the same LAN physical part. So here the parent interface default is always the first one. In our case, it's 1. So make sure you select the LAN parent interface. And the first VLAN we want to add is 20. Simply give it a name. That's it. Super simple. Next, let me add 30 and 40 VLANs. Yeah, we easily added 3 VLANs already. Let's go to this tab for interface assignments. As you can see, the VLANs we created are not here yet. We need to add them. First one, let me choose this one. See, it's available to be added. Let me click add. Here you notice it has the default name OPT something. Let's change it because this is VLAN 20. We plan to use it for IoT devices. Let me click this OPT one. check the enable interface, give it a better name, let's say IoT. For IPv4 configuration type, normally we pick static IPv4. We need to give it a IP address. This IP address will determine its subnet. Let me give it 192.168. Because it's VLAN 20, let's give it 20 subnet. And here I want it to be 24, but based on your requirement, you can give it wider or narrower IP address pool. That's it. Let me click save, apply changes. We have the first new interface set up already. Go back to interface assignments. See, we have this IoT here and it's VLAN 20. It's based on the physical LAN interface. In the similar way, I'm going to set up the other two interfaces. I have set up the 3 new interfaces for IoT surveillance and admin. pfSense has a pretty traditional router setup approach. For example, if you come from UniFi world, Dhcp server setting is part of the network setup. But for pfSense, you need to set it up separately. Let's go to Services, Dhcp Server. For LAN, as I mentioned previously, the initial software installation already enabled the Dhcp server on LAN. We just need to enable these 3 new interfaces we just added. Let me pick the IoT as an example. I say enable Dhcp server. I need to give it a range. Very simple setup. Let's save. It's done. In the same way, I will set up these 2. Now we already have 5 interfaces ready. 2 of them come from the initial installation. 3 of them were set up by us. If I try to use these 3 newly set up interface, I won't be able to connect to other networks or internet, because by default for the new interface you set up, there won't be firewall rules. The way pfSense works is if there's no firewall rules, that means no traffic will be allowed. This is a huge difference if you compare with UniFi routers. Because of the limited time in this initial setup video, we won't be able to cover the firewall rules settings, so we will simply give them all access. In the future videos, we will discuss how to give them different firewall rules. Let me go to Firewall Rules and then go to IoT. As you can see, nothing's here. Let me add one rule, and the default action is pass, which is good. Interface is IoT and it's IPv4, and make sure for protocol you choose any if for all protocols you want to give it a new rule, right? The default is TCP, so many people will forget to change this one. And then because we want to simply set a any to any rule, so I will leave this source and destination to any, then save. Now we have an initial rule. It will give it access to everything, which is what we want to do in this particular video. We are good. I'm going to do the similar thing to the other 2 interfaces. Then we are done in the initial setup for pfSense. But to make our network setup complete, we need to move on to UniFi controller so that we have a switch ready to use this newly set up pfSense networks or interfaces. It's time to talk about UniFi controller. If you use pfSense, you need to host your UniFi controller by yourself. I did have a video in my channel talking about, as a home user, how you can have the UniFi network controller installed. So I won't spend time on that part, but I assume you already have a way to run UniFi controller. For USG Pro, it's similar situation. You need to have a existing UniFi controller. But for UDM-Pro, you cannot use your existing UniFi controller. You have to use the built-in controller in the UDM-Pro. That's the different situation among the 3 different routers. Now let's go to the UniFi controller. This is the UniFi controller for the pfSense network. During using controller, you may notice many such kind of wordings. It says USG is required for what functionality. So you may be surprised if you come from the UDM-Pro world. Now you have the router, firewall, and gateway functionalities handled by pfSense instead of by UniFi controllers. So all those features are not integrated into UniFi controller. For similar functionalities, you need to go to pfSense. In the future videos, we will talk about how to achieve similar functionalities in UniFi routers or in pfSense. By the way, here you see the so-called classic UI for UniFi controller. Because we are going to do the network setup, many features are either hidden, not exposed in the new UI, or it's spreaded everywhere. I don't like the way Ubiquiti organized the menu items for the new UI. I'm using the classic UI for this video. Now we need to set up network. Let's go to settings, go to network. By default, it already have a LAN network. Let's check the details. The type is corporate. If you use pfSense, in most cases, this may be the only corporate network you will have in your UniFi controller settings. For all the other settings, they may only be Vlan only. We will talk about that shortly. Gateway IP is in subnet.1. That's exactly the same as the default setting in pfSense, which means if you do not change the gateway setting in pfSense, the default setting in UniFi controller will work automatically without any change. Lower part, you can see Dhcp settings. If you come from the UDM-Pro or USG world, now keep in mind the Dhcp settings won't matter anymore. All the settings should be done in pfSense, like what we just did for this pfSense network. The default LAN setting works out of box. What we want to do now is to create new network for the VLANs we set up in pfSense. Let's use the IoT as an example. Create new network. Here we need to give it a name. Let's say IoT. Purpose, because even if you choose corporate, it doesn't help you because all the main network functions are handled by pfSense. So here in UniFi controller, I would only create VLAN only network. VLAN ID for IoT is 20. That's it. That's very simple VLAN setting. Let me continue to create the other two for surveillance and admin. I already have the 3 network created. Let me stress that again. When setting up the VLAN only network in UniFi controller, you need to give it VLAN ID. The VLAN ID should be the same as what you set in pfSense. Otherwise, it won't work. Basically, the setup is done in pfSense, but here you are notifying the UniFi controller. This is what I set outside of the UniFi controller. The system automatically creates the corresponding port profile for admin, for IoT, and for surveillance. You do not need to change anything. It's automatically done. You are ready to use them when you configure the switch. In this demo network, I only have one UniFi switch. I connected the Ethernet cables between this particular switch and my Linux virtual machine hardware boxes. For the first part, from the special icon, you can tell it's for uplink and it's connected to the LAN part of my pfSense. I need to configure these 4 ports for my Linux virtual machines. Click the first one. This one is supposed to be connected with the LAN, the default interface. Yes, the setup is all. It's good to me. Now let me change this one. This one should be connected to the IoT network, the port 3. The default is all. I need to change it to IoT. So here it tell you the VLAN ID is 20, which is correct, apply. That's it. I really like UniFi controller. The Vlan setting is very easy, very convenient. Okay, so now we are done with the part changes. This part is connected with profile or this one is IoT, this one is surveillance, this one is admin. We are done in the UniFi controller. Now let's go to the respective Linux virtual machines to test the connection. Now on the screen, I show 3 Linux virtual machines. The top right is for IoT network, and this one is for surveillance network. This one is for admin. Of course, in our setting, we basically set them in the similar way. They are not really for IoT surveillance admin usage yet. In future videos, we are going to discuss how to make more detailed firewall rule settings. But in this video, at least we can validate the basic network setup is done. We are able to communicate inside each network to the other network and to internet. Because we just finished the network settings, I assume we need to reacquire IP address. For example, I'm going to this IoT Linux virtual machine. Then let me go to the network setup. Yeah, now the IP address still in the LAN network. Let me disable the interface, then re-enable it. Okay, it got new IP address. Let me check what's the new IP address. It's in 20 subnet. We are good. I'm going to do the similar thing in the other virtual machines. As you can see on the screen, for all the 3 Linux virtual machines, now they have the new updated IP address. We are ready to do whatever testing we want. For example, for the IoT network, I want to see whether I can connect to internet. Let me ping Google. Okay, it works. Let's say in the admin network, I want to see whether I can access the IoT device. Get the IP address for the IoT network device. It's 20.10. Let me ping it from the admin window. Okay, I can ping it, no problem. Then what's the IP address for the surveillance? It's 3010. I want to admin the camera in the surveillance network. Let me ping it. Okay, no problem. Let's move on to UniFi routers. In the remaining video, we are going to talk about these 2, one for USG Pro, the other one for UDM-Pro. For both, Ubiquiti has similar initial settings. When you reset your routers or just switch on your newly purchased routers, they will have the default 192.168.1.1 IP address. So it's hard-coded, and they will also have the Dhcp enabled, which means for my case, if I try to connect to the router, I can directly type in the IP address for the router and start the initial setting, which is very convenient. Let's go to USG Pro settings first. I'm in the Linux machine, which I already set up the UniFi network controller, but here I'm trying to connect to the USG Pro. I type in the 192.168.1.1 IP address. This is what I see, no problem. Let's accept the risk and continue. So this is a very simple initial screen. In fact, it's not really mandatory you go to this page, but I just want to show you why we even have the DHCP server enabled without doing anything. Here it says congratulations, it's connected, and then it asks me to install UniFi controller so that I can start managing the gateway. Let's see, it's already telling me the current setup for LAN, and as you can see, the DHCP server is already enabled, so you can see the range here already. So if you want, you can even configure something. For example, for the very simple WAN and the LAN change, you can change the subnet for LAN, for example, and you can disable or enable DHCP. The initial setup looks good to me. I will directly go to UniFi controller to start the initial setup. How do I do that? As I mentioned, I won't cover the UniFi network controller installation. I assume you already have one. Now let me connect to it. I'm in the UniFi controller UI. I'm in the device page, And as you can see, I have two devices showing. One is the UniFi switch, and it's common in all the three different scenarios. This one is new. It says pending adoption. It's the USG Pro. Let me click it. We need to first adopt it. This is unique thing for USG Pro because for pfSense, it's not managed by using UniFi controller. For UDM-Pro, it's managed by itself by the UniFi controller built into UDM-Pro, right? Only for USG Pro, you need a separate UniFi controller and you need to first adopt it, just like a normal UniFi AP or switch. Now it's adopted, we are ready. If we go to the network section, it's also slightly different than pfSense scenario. Because for pfSense, we only had one pre-existing network, which is for LAN. But for the USG Pro, now we see a WAN. Why? Because both WAN and LAN, they are managed by using USG Pro. But for pfSense, the UniFi controller is not aware of the WAN at all. So the WAN is completely managed by pfSense. So that's the difference. In our case, we are good with the WAN default settings. As you can see, it's using Dhcp. We have nothing to change in this particular video for WAN. And for LAN, it's corporate network, which is good. Basically, what we want to do is simply configure several new networks for IoT, surveillance, and admin. I will hold on the changing here because the configuration should be exactly the same as in UDM-Pro. Let's first check what we have when we install a brand new UDM-Pro. Let's move on to the UDM-Pro scenario for now. This is a Linux virtual machine in my UDM-Pro network. Let me type in the default IP address, .1.1. Then hit enter. Short video, and then you have the wizard running already. Click the Setup UDM-Pro. Okay, it asks for a name. Agree. Let me adjust the resolution. Let's move on. It's asking about personal or business. To be honest, I'm not aware of any real difference because this video is mainly for home user. Let me choose personal. Here is the UI.com login page. It happened in the past that UniFi required you to have a UI.com credentials to even start the UDM-Pro setup, but now I believe it's already changed. Let me click the skip button. Yeah, it's warning me, and yeah, for this video I don't care about the benefit. Let me proceed without UI.com. Okay, here we go. We are in the setup local access screen. Pretty good. It's asking about the update schedule. For this video's purpose, we are good with the initial setting. I don't want to send those information to Ubiquiti. And here is testing my internet speed. Whatever speed it report, let me say okay. This is the result, and we are done with the wizard. Now we are in the UniFi controller, which is built into the UDM-Pro. Let me click the network application. Let's check the devices. Okay, looks good. UDM-Pro, it's ready. It's showing green. And I have two other devices which I need to reset so that I can adopt into this network. I've adopted this UniFi switch. As you can see, now I have two UniFi devices managed. One is the UDM-Pro itself, another one is a switch. We are good here in the devices. Let's check the existing network settings. Let's go to network. Immediately you can see some differences. Here you see 2.1 configurations already, but it's not in the scope of this particular video. We are going to use this first one part, and we are good with the initial setting, just like in USG Pro. For LAN, it's the similar situation. We can check the existing settings by clicking edit. It's a corporate network, and it has the default .1.1 IP address, and it has DHCP server enabled by default. which is exactly what we need. So we have nothing to change for the LAN interface. For USG Pro and UDM-Pro, yes, the initial wizard might be a little bit different, but once you have the initial steps done, when you start the real network configurations, the steps are exactly the same for this initial setup video. So we will only do it once. Let's pick the UDM-Pro as example. Let's set up a new network, for example, for IoT devices. Let me click a new network. It's the same UI for pfSense when we set up the Vlans in UniFi controller, right? But here, because we are talking about UniFi routers, the Vlans are also managed by USG Pro or UDM-Pro. So here, for the network type or purpose, we need to choose the corporate, not just VLAN only, because we also have other settings which are associated with the network. For example, Dhcp server. That's different if you compare to pfSense scenario. Name it IoT. I'm good with corporate, and it's based on LAN, VLAN ID, let's say 20, gateway IP address. I want to keep all the three scenarios in sync, so I will give them the similar IP address. Then let's update the DHCP range. Okay, just to make sure it's the same as the pfSense scenario. For all other settings, I'm good. I don't want to change anything for this particular initial setup window. Let's save. In the same way, I'm going to set up the surveillance and admin VLANs, and I'm also going to do the same thing in the USG Pro. I have set up the 4 new networks within UDM-Pro, and they all have the corresponding VLANs 20, 30, 40, and the default blank, which is the OR network. We are ready from network setup perspective. In the USG Pro, I also did the same thing. Now let's check the firewall rules. Click the firewall tab. Here, it might be a shock to pfSense users. pfSense has very powerful firewall functionalities, but if you just look at this UniFi firewall settings, you may be lost. For example, it split the different rules into multiple tabs. Just for one, it has 3 tabs. One in, one out, one local. For LAN, it's the similar thing. And it even has separate tabs for guest. And what's in, out, and local. If you look at some existing rules, you can see some wording like established, related, invalid. They are not directly there for pfSense users in pfSense. Then if you check some tabs, for example, one out, it doesn't have anything. What it means exactly, because you may know for pfSense, if you do not have rules defined for your interface, that means no traffic will be routed. What it means, right? So to answer all these confusions or questions from pfSense users, we need to first understand what's in, out, and local. That's the so-called direction for UniFi routers. They are all from the view of the interface, which means in means the traffic entering the interface. Out means the traffic exit the interface. Local means the traffic is directly to the router itself. That's direction. UniFi routers also has the state concept when you define rules. For example, it has established or related or invalid state for different packets. So that's another thing we need to keep in mind. The last thing, which in my opinion, that's even more confusing. That's the default rules. Because in pfSense, there's no default rules. But for UniFi routers, yes, there are default rules and they are not displayed in the UI. And to make it even worse, for each tab, it has different default rules. Basically, to understand how it works exactly, you need to kind of remember for each tab what is the default rule. In this video, we are not going to focus on the firewall rules. We will only explain the basic concept and just pick several examples to explain how it works. And we will have a dedicated video in the future just to compare the firewall rules among the 3 different routers. Let's just pick the one in interface. Let's check the existing default rules. It has the rule indexes. It will follow this sequence to check whether particular traffic is allowed or disallowed. So basically it means the internet traffic which enters the WAN interface, if it's established or related sessions, yes, it's accepted. If it's invalid state, it will be dropped when out. There's nothing here, but it doesn't mean you cannot connect to internet, because by default you are able to connect to internet. But how it works, because for when out, the default firewall rule is allow, is accept, which means it will accept all the traffics which are exiting the WAN interface. So that's how it works. As I mentioned, we have no time to explain them one by one, and we even do not need to add any firewall rules for the UniFi routers, because the default firewall rules in UniFi controller already guarantee our initial setup for all the VLANs. They will work. They will be able to connect to each other. They will be able to connect to internet, because the default firewall rules already guarantee that. As you can see, we haven't changed anything. We already added the network settings. We already added the new VLANs. Then the next thing, let's go to the devices to configure the small UniFi switch to change the port settings. Then we can do some real-world connection testing. Go to the switch. In the same way, the first part is already defined as OR profile. We are good. Move on to the third part. Yeah, we want to change it to IoT. And then for the other 2 part, I'm going to do the same thing. I will change them to the surveillance VLAN and the admin VLAN. Let's move on to the Linux virtual machines. After setting up the networks and checking the firewall rules, we are ready to test the different VLANs. As I mentioned multiple times, the network setup in the 2 UniFi routers are exactly the same. The result should be exactly the same way. So I'm going to just use the UDM-Pro as example. Let's do some testing. I have 3 virtual machines open already. This is IoT, this is surveillance, this is for admin. Let's just do some random internet and local network testing. Let's go to the IoT Linux. Let's ping Google. Let's see whether we can access internet. Yeah, it's working. So remember, we set up Dhcp for this VLAN, and we checked the default firewall rules. We didn't really change anything, right? So by default, everything works as expected, which is good. From admin Linux, I want to see whether I can access a surveillance camera in the surveillance network. I already showed the IP address for the surveillance Linux. Let me ping it from the admin Linux. Okay, it's pingable. So which means the firewall rules for the LAN works as well, right? Basically, that's the simple testing we can do in this video. We make sure the initial setup works, so everything looks good. This video is much longer than I planned, so I had to cut a lot of materials from this initial setup video. Hopefully in the future, when we have the detailed comparison or setup videos for particular areas, we can have more detailed discussion. Okay, thanks for watching.